think there's a lot of a view of Asian Americans almost like we're supposed to be cut off from our spiritual tradition, especially if we're born in the West.
This is David Shi. He's the author of North Asian Magic, Spellcraft from Manchuria, Mongolia, and Siberia.
A lot of shamanic practices are really is tied to the land. And so a lot of their view is if you're not on that ancestral land, why and how the hell would you have spirits because you're not on that land? So a lot of shamanic practices or shamanism or the beliefs in general are tied to one, the ancestors, and two, the land. So in my case, I definitely had the ancestors, but then I also have to not compromise, but work with the fact that the land that I was born in and grew up in is American land and not necessarily Manchurian land or Mongolian land. One interesting thing that happened when I was in Mongolia to see the elders. One of the elders was kind of looking at me, just doing his own divination, and it was kind of funny. He also had a little bit of like a surprise, going like um, because with me, I carry the dual identity of being both American as well as someone of Manchurian descent or Manchu descent. And it's really funny because in Mongolia, when they think of Manchus, like today, they're like, oh, that people have been eaten by Chinese, so they basically don't exist anymore because they're Chinese now. So when they look at me, they were surprised to see Manchu shamanic spirits coming through, because in their minds they're like, "Oh, those spirits still exist." Wow, did not know that. And they're also like, "And you're also American. You have a lot of relatives still in Manchuria, but these spirits came to you." There was almost like this like surprise and almost a little confusion, going like, "How's that possible?"
In November 2019, Shaman Jen and we went to see David give a lecture about North Asian shamanism.
Floor, and then they would just like bang on the floor while doing this, and then this would also put them in a trance. But with this, they're also riding the horses to go somewhere. They're all called horse staffs because there's an image of a horse on the end.
They've been smith. So,
Yeah.
What is that called? Does it have like a specific name?
These probably do that I don't know of. Of these, and it's like that. In the Darha tradition, you'll see they had something like this over their shoulder and the mirror on the side, and then they play with their jaw harp like this. It's also meant as a protection. So the Darha tradition does not wear. It provides the protection for the back part. And then these snakes, they can be protection as well, but they're mainly for drawing in the earth spirits. I'm not sure if I explicitly. These are basically used similarly. They can be used for blessing, for cursing. They could be just an indication of their office. Used more often in Boreas, but used by Darhats as well, used by Shamans as well.
This interview originally was supposed to be a roundtable between myself, David, and Shaman Jen, but unfortunately, tech issues happened, and only the conversation between myself and David was recorded. So if you hear us refer to Jen, or for me to say you guys, it's because originally the interview had Jen.
My name is David Shi. My family is from a region called Manchuria. It is an area in Northeast Asia. Half of it is within China, and the other half is within Russia. My family comes from the Chinese side of Manchuria. So basically, what I am is basically a little bit mixed. My ancestry is primarily Manchu, along with several other things such as Mongol, Chinese, and a little bit of Korean as well. And I am someone who has been identified as having spirits, or specifically having shamanic spirits. I was identified primarily by several traditional Mongolian shamans as well as a couple Korean shamans. So basically, I am someone who is told primarily by shamans in Mongolia that I am supposed to practice traditional shamanism. I'm someone who's chosen by my ancestral spirits. So I'm currently on that path right now, trying to find the proper teacher to take me through the initiation, through that path, and in that process, I'm also doing several practices primarily for myself. Don't usually do services or practices for other people. Sometimes I do occasionally. It's really on a case by case basis. But I am someone who is on that path, and my spirits and practice is primarily a combination of Manchu as well as a little bit of Mongolian, primarily the practice of Inner Mongolia, although a lot of my practice is also advised by people from the country of Mongolia, by traditional Mongolian shamans. In 2016, I was approached and persuaded to write a book on um, the folk magical practices of North Asia. So be primarily Manchuria, Mongolia, as well as Eastern Siberia.
Have you guys heard of that band, that Mongolian metal
Yep.
band called Who?
Basically, the shamanism practiced a little bit more in the interior is based off of a nomadic lifestyle of some sort. Even if the people are no longer nomads, even with Manchus, they haven't been nomads for hundreds of years, but like thousands of years ago they were, and that's when the shamanism developed. But but for them, when you are in a nomadic lifestyle, one of your biggest concerns on a day to day is simply, to put it bluntly, survival. It's being able to survive day by day. In those regions of the northern parts of Asia, the winters are freaking cold. Like it is freezing. It drops to like -20, -30, -40. Doesn't matter if you look at Fahrenheit or Celsius, because at that point it's kind of the same. So people are looking to survive, and people, when they go to the shamans act almost at different points in history, they were either the leaders of the tribes or they were the advisors at some point, because their opinions were relevant in order to not only just surviving but thriving to the next day. So, of course, when people go to see shamans, it's going to be very practical, very real, like everyday concerns. Like for a nomadic person, their big question would be, what's going to happen? What's my flock of sheep going to look like the next year? Will they survive winter? Will my family survive winter? Are there going to be any complications, such as unexpected pregnancies or situations like that? They don't necessarily look to like go to shamans just simply to connect with spirits, because they know the spirits are there. The spirits are in the everyday lives already. They're there affecting us no matter what. So we might as well do what we can to work positively and work harmoniously. When I talk to a lot of people, even from the home countries, they almost see like these spiritual beliefs and methodologies and Western beliefs and methodologies to be at odds and conflicting, when they're really not. A lot of them are actually compatible, in the sense that if you are sick, there's no reason that you shouldn't take Western medicine and do spiritual cleansings and exorcisms at the same time. If anything, they might actually help support each other. The fact that we've come so far in both areas is, I think, really a sign of humanity and spirituality really stepping forward. In my practices and beliefs, we believe that viruses and sickness is a spirit. It's a spirit that's come in. It's a spirit that is means to do harm or cause mischief. Well, we don't necessarily always use, I don't know if the word exorcism has certain connotations, but we have several different methods. It can be an exorcism where you cast the spirit out, or it could be a negotiation where you convince that spirit to leave. Or, I mean, in some cases, in some like really extreme cases, the shaman might actually go into battle and battle that spirit to drive that spirit out. But that's not going to be in contradiction to Western medicine at all. If anything, it's almost they complement each other's in a ways that like a Western medicine like pill might be literally like the new, in terms, I hate to describe it in terms of weapons, but in terms of like warfare, we in the past it was always swords, bows and arrows and stuff, and now we have guns. It's I literally see that's like the kind of, I almost see it that as the that difference as the same difference between traditional spiritual methods of healing and Western medicine forms of healing.
Communism is like a big deal. Like it changed the course of history in East Asia. There's a very good chance that if you meet somebody who's East Asian in America, who's living here, who's an immigrant here, we're here because of communism. We're here because some war happened because of communism. Some sort of economic shit happened because of communism. And that's why our parents decided to leave. So communism in a lot of ways it is so counter to indigenous shamanism, indigenous East Asian religions, the East Asian way for thousands of years. Let's be real here. The history of East Asia, the history of the world outside of America is old as hell. Old, old, old. Civilizations thousands upon thousands of years old. So thousands of years of civilization stopped because of communism. And I mean, and it happened recently, like our grandparents' generation.
Actually, I was having a conversation with my grandmother a few months ago, and she was actually telling me a story that when she was a child, communism had just came into power, but didn't really affect everyday life yet. She would actually see shaman ceremonies in Manchuria. At the time, she was living in North Manchuria near the Russian border, so basically, really the heartland. And she would see ceremonies every day. And whenever they happened, the kids would basically run around town and sort of like like scream announce it because the Slavs oftentimes the ceremonies were very public events and it's something that you saw in everyday life every single day. And when the authorities really cracks down, she would say that they just suddenly overnight they just disappeared, like they just stopped. And the reality is thousands, more than probably tens of thousands of shamans were rounded up. They were hunted down. They were they were imprisoned, probably killed, and shamanism really suffered huge da- damage for the second time in history within Asia. They had to really go underground. Had to really go into secret. Uh, my grandmother was saying she keeps hearing rumors that the ceremonies might have still been happening, but they were just so secretive that people didn't know about. It's almost like shamans were cut out from public life to the extent that a lot of people, when they needed to see a shaman, they could not get access to one because they could only do ceremonies for like trusted family members, trusted relatives, trusted friends, and pretty much and they had to be always on the run because if they stayed in one location too long, that increases their chances of getting caught. So it's how it was able to survive after communism had either in different Asian countries when it fell in Mongolia in the early 90s and when it loosened up in China around the same time, then you saw a lot of shamans are coming out again. They just started doing a couple things more publicly, but it was a very very slow process. Um, so they were able to take on students. That's another thing. They were able to slowly take on students again from a lot of different cultures. There's actually a book on Mongolian, bordered out to Mongolian shamanism called Tragic Spirits, which actually talks about the fact that the spirits weren't honored for so long, for several generations, that when shamanism was legal again, the spirits kind of came rushing back almost like semi angry, like very emotional, oftentimes very angry that they haven't been honored. And people, they said that at that time there were initiations happening everywhere. It's because a lot of these spirits just came charging back to like basically find to choose people to be shamans, and they were initiated. But at the same time, I also need to caveat with this rise also came the rise of the Asian New Age, or basically the fake shamans. They start to arise as well. I think they have arisen pretty much everywhere in Mongolia, in Manchuria, North China, in Korea probably as well, of a lot of there. You have that population of legitimate shamans, and then you have that population of people pretending to be shamans because I guess they see it as profitable. I guess. So this is what shamanism looks like today. You have the legitimate true practitioners who come from lineages that have miraculously stayed unbroken, and then you have people sort of making things up because shamanism has been out of the picture for so long. A lot of everyday people aren't able to recognize when something is off, when something isn't right.
So even though South Korea was never technically communist, of course America like came into the southern part of Korea's defense when the Chinese and northern part of Korea came in. Um, so even though that happened, Christianity, I think, had a big role in trying to wipe out Korean shamanism. So it wasn't just the communists, it was the Western Christian ideas. As Asian Americans, oftentimes we don't really know the native tongue very well. So it's really easy to try to look for information about shamanism, about our indigenous roots online. And there's just not that many resources that have been translated into English. So, and a lot of these indigenous religions, these are verbal traditions, a lot of them. So it's sort of like, well, unless you know somebody and you can speak Korean or you can speak either Mongolian or Chinese like very fluently, and forget about like reading the actual Chinese texts, then it's like, what do? You just turn to whoever comes up on number one in your Google search. And unfortunately, that has often been dominated by people who have a lot of chutzpah, but maybe not as much connection to the actual indigenous culture and tradition. Why are people today so eager to become shamans? Because for the longest time, being a shaman was considered shameful, difficult. If your daughter or your son was called to be a shaman, it was sort of like what did I do wrong in life so that my family has to have this mark against us? Why all of a sudden is it like everybody wants to be a shaman?
Because the word shaman has become a new sexy word, that it almost people almost see that word as have somehow having an attachment of power and somehow some kind of legitimacy. I think it's a lot of misinformation and sort of misconception. A lot of people, they say they want to be a shaman without knowing exactly what a shaman is. It is a very, very specific role, very that takes up pretty much your entire life. And I think a lot of people in the West, and a lot of Asian Americans too, unfortunately, they see the word shaman as just referring to a holy person or like a priest or priestess of an indigenous belief system, and sort of that's it. It's just an indigenous spiritual person, and when there's so much more behind that. I think in a lot of these societies, like you don't have not only do you not have to be a shaman to be spiritual, there are so many other spiritual roles in society as well that I think are often being ignored because the word shaman is sexy in the English language. I just want to like really talk about the roots of the word shaman and how it came into the English language. So I mentioned that I am Manchu. Manchu is part of a wider group of people known as the Tungus people. The Tungus people span from North China to Siberia. And so one of our sister tribes in the north is a group known as the Evenki. They primarily live in Russian Siberia, but there's pockets in North China and Manchuria as well. They were the ones. Actually, we in our languages we all use the word shaman or saman specifically to actually refer to our male shamans specifically. So our male shamans referred to as saman, and then our female shamans were usually referred as wulkan or something to that derivation. So when Russia expanded its empire into Siberia and came across the native Tungus people, and of course, being patriarchal as they were, they saw that these male roles of the shaman were called saman. So then they used that, they took that word and they applied it to basically spiritual leaders within Russian Siberia, which is not that far off, but there is a little bit nuance. And the Russians essentially brought that word to Europe. And from Europe, it went into the French language somehow, I think probably through trade or whatever. And so the French started saying shaman spelled with a CH, And they basically used it to describe basically barbarian pagan peoples through either Russia or Europe. So the pre-Christian pagan like roles, spiritual leader roles, they also start calling referring to them as shamans because they just started using that word to describe everything. And of course, from French, it went to the English language. The English having the largest like empire, or whatever in history, or the largest territorial reach, they started using that word shaman to describe to any indigenous spiritual authority with anywhere. And that was the definition that stuck. And that was especially the definition that stuck in the US when early colonizers started using that word to describe Native American spiritual authority figures, even if though Native Americans, one, they don't have that word, and two, even their elders will admit that their spiritual authorities don't fit with the traditional definition of that word because they looked it up because they did not know the word, so they looked up the original indigenous roots, and they're like, we're not that. But I think that's ultimately that was the definition that stuck in the English language. And when people are hungry to be, say they're hungry to be shamans, they are just looking at that definition. They don't want the a lot of the modern widespread Christian or Muslim or a lot of these like roles. They want to look at indigenous roles. So the first word that comes to their mind, shaman.
I think a lot of people, especially in America, when you hear the word shaman, a lot of people use that word to mean like you are like almost like a medicine woman, medicine man, you have connection with some like greater spirit. But the word shaman is very specific, right? It's very specific to the Northeast Asian region. So you can call somebody who is Korean and works with spirits a shaman. You can call somebody from Mongolia and maybe like that Manchuria, but you wouldn't necessarily call, let's say, somebody from Vietnam who works with spirits. Would you call them a shaman?
No, I would say that more accurately, they're probably mediums, which is where there is a fine line difference. There is a slight but very big difference between their spiritual authorities and the shamans within the more northern regions. I do want to say because this could create some anger or annoyance. Saying if whenever we say someone is not a shaman or their practice is not shamanism, that isn't to say that they are not legitimate or that they're not powerful. I'm sure a 90-year-old spiritual elder from a non-shamanic background could probably still kick my ass. So it's so when we say that they're not a shaman, we're just saying that technically they don't fall under that definition, but that doesn't mean that they're not powerful. That doesn't mean that they're not legitimate.
Is it, would you say it's kind of like you wouldn't call every Christian leader a priest, right? You have to go through a specific initiation to be called a priest. There's ministers, there's priests, there's all these other names that you can call them. So shaman, when we talk about shamanism, we're talking about a very specific sect and a very specific title of somebody who's gone through the many year long tradition and initiation, right? We're talking about actual initiation.
If I were to be more specific, and this is just from years of not only study but conversations with other shamans, I would say that there's really three defining traits of what a shaman is. One is it's specific people chosen by specific spirits. So you can't study to be a shaman. You're either born with that destiny or that mandate, or you're not. So that's number one. Number two, they have to be able to go into repeatable, controlled trance states to access their spirits. Either their spirits come into them and possess them, um, or their own spirit or soul flies out. And that actually leads to number three, the ability to do of spirit flight, where your own soul actually flies out into the spirit world. And I want a lot of Western people who practice core shamanism, which um, I won't talk too much about, but they have a incorrect um, view of what journeying or what they call shamanic journeying is. Because if you it was a true journey where your soul is out of your body would either become an empty shell, or there would be one of your spirits would be there they're protecting it. So it literally it'd be they if their spirit, their soul is gone, they're doing like a soul retrieval, whatever. You can literally push the person over, and they wouldn't know, they wouldn't feel a thing because their soul is not there anymore. I'm pretty sure for a lot of Western shamanic circles that they were doing like a guided meditation or like their shamanic journey. I'm pretty sure if I pushed them, they would realize that I pushed them.
That makes sense. That actually makes sense to me. And how Westerners, when they use the word shaman, they're usually not talking about, especially the soul leaving the body and stuff like that. Again, it sounds much more in the West that it's used to describe somebody who's really wise and spiritual. They're just generally called shaman.
So actually, the spirit flight that I talked about, that doesn't happen too often. In fact, most shamans prefer not to do that if they can because it's a huge strain on the mind and the body. So they actually still also do call the spirits in to possess them as in transposition possession. That's much easier than spirit flight, and even then it's actually still a little straining. So it's almost like they try to do the easiest thing possible for the task at hand, but they will and they can go to those measures. And not that I'm a Korean shaman or anything, but I would actually consider Korean shamanism to be within the family of the shamanism that comes from Manchuria and Mongolia and Siberia. Because Jen, I think we had a conversation before where there is a story or multiple stories in Korean shamanism about soul retrievals, about spirit flight and soul retrievals. So that's proof that that can happen, that it does exist. And then two, I think archaeologically speaking, Korean shamanism did actually appear amongst the Korean peoples as a almost like a migration from more interior lands, whether it is Manchuria or Mongolia or Siberia. It is, I think, archaeologically clear that there is a, a connection, even a blood connection. So and with shamanic spirits, they travel down lineages by blood. It actually comes people who are chosen as shamans. They have the blood. It travels that way. So I definitely do consider Korean shamanism, even though I don't practice it, to be within the same family as the shamanism from those interior regions.
So, David, you mentioned that you had spirit sickness and that it was really bad until you started going down this path of possible initiation in the future. So, what were your symptoms like? Yeah, I just wanted to impress upon the viewers that just because you have what might be considered spirit sickness, and who knows, maybe I've had it too, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go down this road of being an initiated shaman. What I do, which is a very mundane thing, editing videos and putting it up on YouTube, that is a type of spiritual practice as well, because I'm trying to disseminate the spiritual information out to the world. So that's what I'm doing as my part. That's my spiritual path. So you don't automatically have to go and decide that you're going to spend thousands of dollars and years of your life because you have spirit sickness or because spirits talk to you. You should definitely go to a professional, a mudang, a shaman, get lots, just like any other illness, right? Get lots of different opinions and then go from there. And that's probably one of the ways that all the fake shamanism going on can be kind of culled, right? By people kind of going to the right professionals and getting the right diagnoses.
My symptoms were less physical. It was mostly psychological and partially mental. Um, I I actually don't know if I have any diagnosed psychological disorders because my parents never felt the need to take me to go check. So I can only speak based on my like what I felt. But basically, it was almost like it growing up, I was always either alternating between manic and paranoid to like constant anxiety, um, severe depression. When I was much younger, actually, this was a repressed memory that was brought up, but apparently, every night as a child, I basically saw ghosts and demons like next to my bed like almost every night, and I could only go to sleep if I was like completely under the covers, because that was the only way I could calm myself. And even getting older, I think I developed into this habit where I was able to ignore some of the things I was seeing to the point where I wasn't seeing them anymore. But a lot of like it just felt like there was always emotional or mental trauma or baggage. Um, the only reason why I succeeded academically the way I did is really just through constantly pushing myself because I couldn't focus. My focus was pretty bad. My parents thought maybe I had ADD or something because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus at all. And this even went on in college. Um, so this was all before I even had any awareness of what shamanism was. And I did notice that when I discover that this path exists, and I did research and I basically was getting pulled into it, then some of these symptoms start to alleviate themselves slowly, but very slowly. And then I start getting recurring dreams that weren't so chaotic anymore. Now they were starting to become a little bit clear with what my ancestors were trying to say to me. Um, basically, in my case, the shamanic lineage in my family has been broken for several hundred years, but it's not so long that those shamanic spirits are not around anymore. And they saw an opportunity to try to mend or repair this lineage. So they were trying to guide me into that path. Um, but even for this entire time that I was doing this, I would never call myself a shaman or a shaman to be because I did recognize that you have to be recognized, you have to be identified, and that's the only way to know. Otherwise, it's just being presumptuous. There could probably be some other cure or some other spiritual way of dealing with it. There's many different types of spiritual paths. Even if it's not a shaman, it could be different types of spiritual healers. Even in Mongolia and Manchuria, and probably Siberia too, the role of a midwife was also a spiritual calling that required initiation. Um, Probably not going to be me, but but there are many different possibilities. And even with shamans, as Jen said, there are many different types of shamans who do different things to varying degrees. In practice, they probably won't look too different from case to case. I think what Korean shamanism has done more than other forms of shamanism is that there's a lot more categorizations, which in a lot of more other North Asian traditions, it's not as clear cut. But yeah, so that's kind of been my story. It's these days the sickness is still kind of there, but I can handle it much better. Sometimes there are flare-ups. Um, I still do get some episodes sometimes where it happens mostly at night, where sometimes I don't know why. I might just be like violently shaking in bed for a few minutes, and I just don't know why. Or even like cases like insomnia, and sometimes some emotional cases as well. I don't want to describe it as necessarily existentialism, but like something kind of along those lines just happens just randomly, and then after anywhere from 5 minutes to 5 hours, it just also suddenly disappears.
I really hope that everyone enjoyed this interview with David, and if you want to check out his book, North Asian Magic, it's available on Amazon. Link is in the description box below.